March 6, 1944, 11:47 in the morning. At 28,000 feet over central Germany, the air is thin and brutally cold. Oxygen masks frost over with each breath. The roar of engines, hundreds of them, fills the sky with a mechanical thunder that drowns out all thought. Below, through breaks in the clouds, the patchwork fields of Bavaria spread like a faded quilt, stitched with roads and rivers that glint in the pale winter sun. Above, contrails streak across the blue, mile after mile of white vapor trails marking the passage of the largest air armada ever assembled. 672 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flying in tight formation, their bomb bays loaded with high explosive and incendiary munitions destined for Berlin. Escorting them are 801 American fighter aircraft, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and a newer machine that most Luftwaffe pilots have not yet encountered in numbers, the P-51 Mustang. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. In the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 119 G6, climbing hard toward the bomber stream, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter scans the sky ahead. He is 23 years old, a veteran of 2 years of combat over the Eastern and Western fronts. He has 47 confirmed kills. He knows how bomber escorts behave. They fly close to the formations for a while, provide cover during the initial penetration of German airspace, and then, inevitably, they turn back. Their fuel runs low, their range ends, and the bombers continue alone, vulnerable, exposed to the full fury of the Reich's fighter defenses. This has been the pattern since 1942. This is what every Luftwaffe pilot has been trained to expect. Wait for the escorts to leave. Then, attack. Richter checks his fuel gauge. He has time. He adjusts his oxygen mask, flexes his fingers on the control stick, and watches the contrails grow closer. Soon, the American fighters will turn back. Soon, the killing will begin. But today, something is different. The Mustangs do not turn back. For 2 years, the strategic bombing campaign over Nazi Germany had been a brutal war of attrition. The premise was simple. By destroying Germany's industrial capacity, its factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and military production centers, the Allies could cripple the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war. Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces committed tens of thousands of men and thousands of aircraft to this mission, but the execution was anything but simple. German air defenses were formidable. Flak batteries surrounded every major city and industrial target, filling the sky with explosive shells that detonated in black clouds of shrapnel. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, equipped with FW-190s and Bf-109s flown by experienced pilots, intercepted. Bomber formations with coordinated attacks, targeting engines, fuel tanks, and cockpits. The bombers themselves were heavily armed, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, but flying in tight formation to create overlapping fields of fire. This strategy worked to a point, but without fighter escorts, the bombers were slowly being bled to death. The mathematics were stark. In October 1943, during a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 out of 291 bombers, a loss rate of over 20%. At that rate, a bomber crew's odds of surviving the required 25 missions were less than 1 in 4. The losses were unsustainable. Mission after mission was scrubbed or delayed because there were not enough aircraft, not enough crews, not enough escorts with the range to protect the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe understood this. Their strategy was simple. Avoid the escorts when possible. Wait for them to turn back due to fuel limitations, then mass against the unprotected bombers. And it worked. Throughout 1943, American daylight bombing raids penetrated deep into Germany, only to suffer catastrophic losses once the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts and F-38 Lightnings reached the limits of their fuel and had to return home. The bombers continued alone, and the Luftwaffe slaughtered them. The problem was not the fighters themselves. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a superb aircraft, rugged, powerful, heavily armed. The P-38 Lightning had speed and firepower, but both were limited by range. Even with drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, the P-47 could only escort bombers about 475 miles from base before it had to turn back. The P-38 could go farther, but it suffered mechanical problems at high altitude and was never produced in sufficient numbers. What the 8th Air Force needed was a fighter that could fly to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles, while still having enough fuel to engage enemy fighters in combat. In 1942, such an aircraft did not exist, or rather, it existed, but no one quite believed it could do what it was designed to do. The North American P-51 Mustang was originally built for the British Royal Air Force in 1940. Early versions were fast and maneuverable at low altitude, but performed poorly above 15,000 feet due to their Allison engines. The RAF used them for reconnaissance and ground attack, but they were not considered viable as high-altitude escorts. The aircraft was, in the eyes of many, a promising design that had missed its potential. Then someone had an idea. Replace the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin. The results were extraordinary. With the Merlin engine, license-built by Packard in the United States, the P-51B and P-51D variants became one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war. They were fast, reaching speeds over 440 miles per hour. They were agile, capable of outturning most German fighters. And, most importantly, they had range. With internal fuel and two 108-gallon drop tanks, a P-51 could escort bombers 850 miles from base, far enough to reach Berlin, engage enemy fighters, and return home. By early 1944, P-51 Mustangs were arriving in England by the hundreds, and with them came a new strategy. Stick with the bombers. All the way. No matter what. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter watches the bomber formation approach. The sky is crowded with aircraft, silver specks glinting in the sunlight, contrails weaving a white lattice across the blue. He can see the escorts now, sleek single-engine fighters with liquid-cooled inline engines and distinctive bubble canopies. Mustangs. He has heard about them, heard the rumors from other pilots who survived encounters over France and the Low Countries. They are fast, they are dangerous. But they are still fighters, and fighters have fuel limits. He checks his watch. The bombers are deep into German airspace now, approaching the outer defenses of Berlin. Surely the escorts must turn back soon. Surely they cannot have enough fuel to go farther. But the Mustangs stay. Richter keys his radio, checks in with his squadron leader. The response is terse. Wait, they will turn back. But they do not turn back. Minutes pass. The bomber formation drones onward. The Mustangs weave above and around them, maintaining their protective screen. Richter feels a cold unease settle in his gut. This is wrong. This is not how it is supposed to happen. The escorts are supposed to leave. That is the pattern. That is the rule. And then he understands. The rules have changed. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first large-scale raid on Berlin in daylight. It was a statement of intent, a demonstration that American air power could strike the heart of the Reich, regardless of distance or defenses. But it was also a test of whether the P-51 Mustang could do what its designers promised, escort bombers all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter. Over 500 German aircraft rose to meet the bombers, Bf-101s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Me-410 heavy fighters armed with cannons and rockets designed to shatter bomber formations from beyond machine gun range. The German pilots climbed hard, positioning themselves for the standard tactic. Wait for the escorts to leave, then strike in massed formations, overwhelming the bombers' defensive fire with speed and numbers. But the Mustangs did not leave. At 50 miles from Berlin, the Mustangs were still there. At 30 miles, they were still there. Over the target itself, as flak filled the sky and bombers released their payloads over factories and rail yards, the Mustangs circled overhead, engaging any Luftwaffe fighter that attempted to close with the formations. And on the long, vulnerable flight home, when bomber crews were exhausted, ammunition was low, and damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude, the Mustangs were still there. For the first time in the strategic bombing campaign, American heavy bombers flew to Berlin and back with continuous fighter escort for the entire mission. The Luftwaffe, which had built its defensive strategy around the assumption that escorts would eventually turn back, found itself facing an enemy that refused to follow the script. The impact was immediate and devastating. Luftwaffe fighter units that had been accustomed to attacking bombers with relative impunity now found themselves fighting for their lives against an opponent that was faster, more maneuverable, and present in overwhelming numbers. German pilots who had scored kills against lumbering B-17s now faced P-51s that could chase them down in a dive, outturn them in a dogfight, and stay with them all the way to the deck. The loss rates reversed. In the first quarter of 1944, before the widespread deployment of the Mustang, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 4.2% of its bombers per mission. But the second quarter, with Mustangs providing long-range escort, that rate had dropped to 1.9%. Luftwaffe losses, meanwhile, skyrocketed. In March and April alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 800 fighters, and worse, over 400 pilots, many of them irreplaceable veterans with years of combat experience. German airmen began to dread missions against American bomber formations. The sight of Mustangs, with their distinctive bubble canopies and checkered cowlings, became a source of fear. Pilots who had once eagerly scrambled to intercept the heavy raids now hesitated, knowing that the escorts would not leave, that the fight would be long and brutal, and that survival was no longer a matter of skill, but of luck. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down and captured in April 1944, told his interrogators, "Before, we waited for your fighters to leave. Then we attacked the bombers. Now, your fighters do not leave. They stay with the bombers to the target. They stay with the bombers on the return. They hunt us all the way back to our airfields. We have no safe time. We have no advantage. We can only die." It was a bleak assessment, and it was accurate. The P-51 Mustang became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of American industrial capacity, technological adaptability, and strategic reach. The Luftwaffe had assumed that geography was on their side, that the sheer distance from England to Berlin would protect them. The Mustang proved that assumption wrong. It collapsed the protective buffer of space that had shielded German industry, turned the skies over the Reich into contested battlegrounds, and made it clear that nowhere was safe from Allied air power. But the Mustang's impact went beyond tactics and statistics. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of air warfare. For decades, fighters had been seen as short-range defensive weapons or tools for gaining local air superiority. The idea of a fighter that could escort bombers across an entire continent, engage the enemy over the target, and return home was revolutionary. It required not just a good aircraft, but an excellent one, and the industrial base to produce it by the thousands. By the end of the war, over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been built. They served in every theater, from the skies over Germany to the Pacific Islands. But it was over Europe, in the long, grinding campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe and break the back of German war production, that the Mustang proved its worth. German engineers and pilots recognized this. After the war, many Luftwaffe veterans cited the arrival of the P-51 as the turning point in the air war. Not because it was invincible, it was not, but because it was everywhere, and it stayed. The psychological impact of facing an enemy who refused to leave, who pursued you relentlessly, who had the fuel and the stamina to fight from England to Berlin and back, was crushing. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter does not make it home from the mission on March 6, 1944. His Bf-109 is shot down by a P-51 flown by Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, one of the top American aces of the war. Richter bails out over Brandenburg and survives, but his aircraft does not. He spends the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, and in the decades after, he rarely speaks about his experiences. But in a recorded interview conducted in 1981, he is asked what he remembers most about the air war over Germany. His answer is simple: the Mustangs. They never left. We kept waiting for them to turn back, to run out of fuel, to go home. But they never did. They stayed with the bombers to the target, and they stayed with the bombers all the way home. And we could not understand how this was possible. We thought, surely this is a trick. Surely they will leave soon. But they did not leave, and that is when we knew we could not win. It is a remarkable admission, not a confession of cowardice or defeat in battle, but a recognition that the strategic equation had changed. The Luftwaffe had been built to fight a short war, to seize air superiority through aggression, and then maintain it through defensive attrition. But the Mustang turned attrition into a losing game. Every mission, German fighters were outnumbered, outranged, and forced to fight in conditions where the Americans had every advantage. The success of the P-51 was not solely due to its design. It was the product of a system, a network of factories, supply chains, training programs, and strategic planning that the Axis powers could not match. The Packard Motor Company, which built the Merlin engines under license from Rolls-Royce, produced over 55,000 engines during the war. North American Aviation, which built the Mustang airframe, employed tens of thousands of workers and operated multiple production lines running around the clock. The fuel that powered the Mustangs, 100-octane aviation gasoline, was refined in quantities that dwarfed anything Germany could produce. And behind all of this was a doctrine that air superiority was not just desirable but essential, and that achieving it required not just shooting down enemy aircraft, but destroying their ability to resist. The Mustangs were not just defending bombers. They were hunting the Luftwaffe, forcing it into battle and bleeding it dry. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Training programs had been gutted. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. And when the invasion came, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 100. The battle for air superiority over Europe was over. The Mustang had won. There is a photograph, taken in late 1944, of a formation of P-51 Mustangs flying escort for a stream of B-17s over Germany. The bombers are in tight formation, their contrails streaming behind them like ribbons. The Mustangs fly in loose pairs, weaving above and below, vigilant and tireless. In the background, far below, the ground is obscured by clouds. There is no indication of the ground battle, the cities being bombed, the people suffering below. There is only the sky and the machines that dominate it. It is a sterile image, almost peaceful, but it represents a kind of violence that the Luftwaffe could not counter, the violence of presence. The Mustangs were not just shooting down German fighters. They were denying the Luftwaffe the opportunity to fight on favorable terms. They were forcing German pilots to engage in battles they could not win, to take off knowing they would likely not return, to watch their comrades fall and know there was no respite, no reprieve, no moment when the escorts would turn back and the odds would shift. After the war, a group of former Luftwaffe pilots was invited to tour a P-51 Mustang at an American air base in occupied Germany. They walked around the aircraft, examined the engine, sat in the cockpit. One of them, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, was asked what he thought. He ran his hand along the wing, felt the smooth aluminum skin, and said, "It is a beautiful aircraft, and it killed us." There was no bitterness in his voice, only acknowledgement. The P-51 Mustang was not invincible. Over 2,500 were lost in combat, and hundreds of pilots died flying them. But it was effective in a way that transcended individual duels or tactical victories. It was effective because it changed the fundamental dynamics of the air war. It took away the Luftwaffe's advantages, time, distance, the ability to choose when and where to fight, and replaced them with a relentless, grinding pressure that could not be escaped. In that sense, the Mustang was not just a weapon. It was a statement that American industry could produce not just more aircraft, but better ones. A statement that American pilots could fly deep into enemy territory and fight on equal or better terms, with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. A statement that the age of defensive air warfare, of waiting for the enemy to come to you, was over. The future belonged to whoever could project power farthest, fastest, and most persistently. And in 1944, that was the United States. April 25th, 1945. 2:34 in the afternoon. The last major Luftwaffe resistance over Germany collapses. Fuel depots are empty. Airfields are cratered by bombing. The few remaining fighters are hidden in forests or flown by novice pilots with only a handful of training hours. The Mustangs, meanwhile, fly at will, strafing convoys, shooting up rail yards, escorting bombers to targets that barely matter anymore because the war is already won. An American pilot, returning from a mission over Bavaria, radios to his wingman. "Where are the bandits?" The reply is matter of fact. There aren't any. And there are not. The Luftwaffe, which once filled the skies with hundreds of fighters, which once made the mere act of flying over Germany a death sentence for bomber crews, is gone. Not destroyed in a single dramatic battle, but worn down, mission after mission, kill after kill, until there is nothing left. The Mustang did that. Not alone, not without the bombers it escorted, the pilots who flew it, the ground crews who maintained it, the factories that built it. But it was the instrument, the tool that made the strategy possible. And long after the war, when veterans gathered and historians debated and documentaries tried to capture the enormity of the air campaign, one image remained fixed in memory, the sight of Mustangs staying with the bombers, not turning back, not running out of fuel, not leaving, just staying, all the way to the target, all the way home. The Luftwaffe had built its strategy on a simple assumption, that escorts would always have to turn back, that geography and fuel capacity would create a window of vulnerability, a moment when the bombers would be alone and exposed. The P-51 Mustang destroyed that assumption, and with it, it destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to resist. The war in the air was not won by a single brilliant maneuver or a decisive dogfight. It was won by endurance, by the ability to stay in the fight longer, fly farther, and return to fight again the next day and the day after that. The Germans had courage, they had skill, they had experience, but the Americans had range, and range in the end was everything. The contrails faded, the engines fell silent, the bombers returned home, and the fighters returned with them. Day after day, mission after mission, all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe had asked, "Where are the escorts?" The answer was always the same, right there, staying with the bombers to the turn home, and beyond. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.